Welcome to Mind Leapic, your go-to channel for soothing, monotonous history tales designed to help you drift off to sleep. In this video, we explore the tedious and hazardous world of a Victorian-era baker, along with other dull historical details from the time. If you find this relaxing, please give it a like. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let the calm narration begin. In the Victorian era, which spanned from 1837 to 1901, during the reign of Queen Victoria, baking was one of the most common yet grueling occupations in Britain, especially in growing urban centers like London, Manchester, and Birmingham. Bakers were essential to society because bread formed the staple of nearly every meal for people across all social classes, from the poorest laborers to the middle-class families and even the aristocracy, though the quality varied greatly depending on one's status and location. The working-class population, which made up the majority of Britain's inhabitants, relied heavily on bread as a cheap source of sustenance, often consuming up to 2 pounds per person per day in some households. This demand meant that bakers had to produce vast quantities of loaves daily, operating in small, often underground bakehouses that dotted the city streets and alleyways. These bakehouses were typically cramped, poorly ventilated spaces located in basements to save on rent and to contain the heat from the ovens. But this setup contributed significantly to the unhealthy conditions that plagued the trade. The daily routine of a Victorian baker was a relentless cycle of labor that began late at night and extended well into the following day, leaving little time for rest or personal life. Typically, a journeyman baker, who was an employee rather than the master owner, would start his shift around 11 o'clock in the evening. At this hour, the streets outside would be quiet, with gas lamps flickering dimly as the city wound down. But inside the bakehouse, the work was just commencing. The first task was to prepare the dough, a process that involved measuring out large quantities of flour, water, yeast, and salt. Flour came in heavy sacks, weighing up to 280 pounds each, which the baker had to haul from storage areas, often up and down narrow stairs, straining their backs and shoulders in the process. The flour itself was not always pure. Millers and bakers sometimes adulterated it with cheaper substances to stretch supplies and increase profits, a common practice in an era before strict food regulations. Once the ingredients were gathered, the baker would mix them in a large wooden trough, a rectangular container about 6 feet long and 2 feet deep, positioned at waist height for kneading. This mixing was done by hand, as mechanical mixers were rare in smaller operations until later in the century. The baker would pour in the flour, creating clouds of fine white dust that filled the air and settled on every surface, including the workers' clothes, hair, and lungs. Breathing in this flour, dust, day after day, led to a condition known as baker's asthma or baker's lung, where the respiratory system became irritated and inflamed, causing chronic coughing, wheezing, and shortness of breath. In the dim light of oil lamps or early gas lights, which cast long shadows and added to the oppressive atmosphere, the baker would stir the mixture with a wooden paddle or his bare arms, gradually forming a sticky mass. Water was added carefully, sourced from local pumps or wells that were not always clean, potentially introducing contaminants like bacteria that could spoil the dough or even cause illnesses in consumers. After initial mixing, the dough needed to be left to rise, a process facilitated by the yeast, which was often homemade, from a fermented starter or purchased as brewer's yeast from nearby alehouses. During this waiting period, which could last a couple of hours, The exhausted baker might try to catch a brief nap. Many would simply spread a flour sack over the kneading board on top of the trough and lie down right, there in the bakehouse, surrounded by the warm, yeasty smell and the constant hum of the city above, the heat from the oven, which was being stoked with coal or wood to build up temperature, made the space stuffy and uncomfortable, with temperatures rising to between 75 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit even in the cooler months. Sleep was fitful at best, interrupted by the need to check the dough or tend the fire, and bakers averaged only 4 to 5 hours of rest per night, contributing to their overall fatigue and diminished health. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the baker would rouse himself to begin the strenuous task of kneading. This involved pounding, folding, and stretching the dough repeatedly on the board to develop the gluten and ensure an even texture in the final bread. Kneading by hand required immense physical strength, as the dough for dozens or even hundreds of loaves had to be worked for up to an hour at a time. The baker's arms and back would ache from the repetitive motions, and over years, this led to chronic musculoskeletal problems, including severe back pain, joint inflammation, and deformities in the hands and shoulders. Sweat would pour down their faces in the sweltering heat, mixing with the flour to form a pasty residue on their skin. The bakehouse environment exacerbated these issues. The enclosed basement trapped not only heat but also fumes from the burning fuel, which could include sulfurous coal smoke that irritated the eyes and throat. Ventilation was minimal, often just a small window or vent that did little to circulate fresh air, leading to carbon monoxide buildup in extreme cases. Once kneaded, the dough was scaled off into portions, each weighed to ensure uniform loaves, typically around 4 pounds for a standard quartern loaf that sold for about 4 pence. The baker used a simple beam scale for this, balancing the dough against iron weights, a tedious process repeated hundreds of times. Then came molding, where each portion was shaped into a loaf by hand, rolled and tucked to form the familiar oblong shape. This was done quickly but precisely, as any imperfections could affect baking. The loaves were then placed on wooden peels, long-handled shovels, and slid into the brick oven, which had been heated to around 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Managing the oven was a skill in itself. The baker had to judge the temperature, by feel or by throwing in a handful of flour, to see how quickly it browned, as thermometers were not common. Baking took about an hour per batch, during which the baker would prepare rolls or fancy breads for wealthier customers, such as twisted cottage loaves or buns flavored with currants. As the bread baked, the aroma would fill the bakehouse, a comforting scent amid the hardship. But the intense heat near the oven mouth caused burns and blisters on the arms and hands if not careful. Protective gear was rudimentary, perhaps just thick mittens or cloths. Once baked, the loaves were removed, using the peel and set on racks to cool slightly before being carried upstairs, to the shop, or out for delivery. By dawn, around 6 or 7 in the morning, the first batches were ready, and the baker might have to change into cleaner clothes to venture onto the streets, hawking the hot bread to early risers, factory workers heading to shifts, or housewives shopping for the day. This selling phase added more hours to the workday, trudging through crowded, foggy streets with heavy baskets or barrows, exposed to the elements whether rain, snow, or smog from industrial chimneys. The long hours, often 17 to 18 per day, 6 days a week, took a severe toll on bakers' health. Beyond respiratory ailments, they suffered from rheumatic fever due to the constant shifts between hot bakehouses and cold outdoors, erysipelas, a painful skin infection, and inflammation of the lungs that could progress to pneumonia. Consumption, or tuberculosis, was rampant, spread in the damp, dusty environments, and weakened immune systems from malnutrition and exhaustion. Heart diseases, including palpitations and epileptic seizures, were linked to the stress and irregular sleep patterns. Studies from the mid-19th century, such as one in 1848, highlighted how these conditions led to a lowered life expectancy, with many bakers dying in their 40s or 50s. The trade's physical demands also caused premature aging. Bakers appeared older than their years, with stooped postures and pallid complexions from lack of sunlight. Adulteration of bread compounded the dangers, not just for consumers but for bakers handling the substances. Alum, a chemical compound used to whiten bread and make it appear fresher, was added in powder form during mixing. While it helped with texture in poor quality flour, it interfered with digestion, causing bowel problems, constipation, and chronic diarrhea, which were especially fatal for children who ate bread as their main food. Bakers exposed to alum dust risked similar issues, plus skin irritations. Other adulterants included plaster of Paris for bulk, chalk to neutralize acidity, or even ground bones, all of which posed health risks during handling. Millers sometimes pre-adulterated flour, so bakers unwittingly worked with toxic materials. Government inquiries in the 1850s and 1860s exposed these practices, leading to the Food Adulteration Act of 1860. But enforcement was lax, and unscrupulous bakers continued for profit. Socially, bakers formed a tight-knit but dissipated community. Low wages, around 15 to 20 shillings per week for journeymen, meant they lived in poverty, often in the same crowded tenements as their customers. Unions emerged in the 1840s, leading to strikes for better hours and pay. But masters resisted, citing competition. On their one half-day off, Saturday evenings, bakers gathered in public houses, not just for recreation but to seek work, fostering habits of heavy drinking that further harmed health. Memoirs from the era describe bakers as pale, weary men with flour-dusted coats, symbols of their unending toil. In rural areas, baking differed slightly. Village bakers used communal ovens and worked shorter hours, but urbanization drew many to cities for opportunities, only to find harsher realities. Scottish apprentices, known for their skills in both bread and biscuits, migrated south, adding to the workforce glut and depressing wages. By the late Victorian period, technological advances like steam-powered ovens in larger factories began changing the trade. But for most small bakehouses, the manual, dangerous labor persisted. This monotonous routine defined the Victorian baker's existence, a life of quiet endurance amid flour clouds and furnace glows, where each loaf represented hours of unseen struggle. As we continue in later parts, we'll delve deeper into specific recipes, tools, and the broader food culture of the time, but for now, let the steady rhythm of these facts lull you further. The Victorian bakers. Craft was a repetitive, labor-intensive process that demanded precision despite its grueling nature, with every step governed by tradition, necessity, and the limitations of the era's technology. Bread was the cornerstone of the Victorian diet, and its production in the 1800s was a daily ritual that began in the small hours and ended only when the last loaf was sold. In this part, we'll explore the intricate, often mind-numbingly repetitive steps of bread making in a typical urban bakehouse, from sourcing ingredients to the final delivery, all while highlighting the unchanging rhythm that defined the baker's existence. The process began with the raw materials, primarily flour, which was the foundation of every loaf. Flour in Victorian Britain came from local mills, where wheat was ground between massive stones powered by water, wind, or, increasingly, steam. The quality of flour varied widely. The finest white flour, known as patent or firsts, was reserved for the wealthy, while working-class bakers used coarser second- or third-grade flour, often brownish and speckled with bran. These lower grades were prone to spoilage, attracting weevils or mold if not stored properly in the bakehouse's damp, warm conditions. Bakers had to inspect sacks carefully, sifting through with their hands to check for lumps or pests, a tedious task that could take hours for large deliveries. The flour was stored in wooden bins or sacks, stacked in corners of the already cramped bakehouse, where it absorbed moisture from the air, adding to the baker's challenge of achieving consistent dough. Water, another critical ingredient, was sourced from public pumps, wells, or rivers, depending on the bakery's location. In cities like London, water quality was a constant concern. The Thames and its tributaries were notoriously polluted, contaminated with sewage, industrial runoff, and debris. Bakers had no choice but to use what was available, hauling heavy buckets back to the bakehouse, sometimes over long distances. Filtering was rudimentary, often just a cloth to catch larger particles, leaving bacteria and sediments that could taint the bread. The baker would measure water by eye, or with a notched stick, pouring it slowly into the trough to avoid splashing, a process that required steady hands despite the fatigue of late-night work. Yeast, the agent that made bread rise, was another variable that demanded careful handling. In smaller bakehouses, bakers often maintained their own starter, a fermented mixture of flour and water kept alive from batch to batch. This starter, sometimes called a barm, was stored in a cool corner of the bakehouse, away from the oven's heat, and required daily feeding with fresh flour to keep it active. If neglected, it could turn sour, ruining the dough's flavor. Alternatively, bakers might purchase brewer's yeast from nearby alehouses, a byproduct of beer fermentation that was cheaper but less reliable, as its strength varied depending on the brewer's process. Measuring yeast was a delicate task. Too much could cause the dough to over-rise, collapsing in the oven, while too little meant flat, heavy loaves that customers would reject. The baker would crumble the yeast into the water, stirring gently to dissolve it, a slow process that filled the air with a faint, sour tang. Salt, the final key ingredient, was added for flavor and to strengthen the dough's structure. It came in coarse blocks or crystals, which the baker had to grind by hand using a mortar and pestle, another repetitive chore that added to the night's workload. The proportions, roughly 1 pound of salt per 100 pounds of flour, had to be exact, as too much made the bread unpalatable, while too little left it bland. Once all ingredients were prepared, the baker combined them in the wooden kneading trough, a process that began around midnight. The trough, often caked with dried dough from previous batches, had to be scraped clean with a metal blade, a task that could take up to 20 minutes for a large trough. Mixing was done by hand, the baker plunging his arms into the sticky mass, folding and stirring until it formed a cohesive dough. This initial mixing took about 30 minutes per batch, with the baker's hands becoming coated in a gluey residue that was hard to wash, off in the limited water available. The dough was then left to rise, or prove, for several hours, covered with a damp cloth to prevent a crust forming. During this time, the baker tended the oven, a massive brick structure that dominated the bakehouse. The oven was heated by burning wood or coal, a process that began hours earlier to reach the necessary temperature. The baker would shovel fuel into the firebox, located beneath or to the side of the oven chamber, monitoring the flames to ensure an even burn. Coal, increasingly common in urban areas, produced a steady heat but filled the bakehouse with acrid smoke, stinging the eyes and throat. Wood was cleaner but harder to source in cities, requiring the baker to break logs into manageable pieces. Another physical task. Maintaining the oven's temperature was a constant balancing act. If too hot, the bread would burn on the outside while remaining raw inside. But if too cool, it wouldn't rise properly. The baker judged the heat by experience, sometimes sprinkling flour on the oven floor to gauge how quickly it scorched. While the dough proved, the baker might clean tools or prepare secondary products like rolls or biscuits, which required their own recipes and techniques. Rolls, popular with the middle class, were made from finer flour and shaped into small rounds, a fiddly task that demanded dexterity despite the baker's exhaustion. Biscuits, often plain and hard, were baked for longer shelf life and sold to shops or street vendors. These side tasks added variety, but also extended the workday, as each item had to be mixed, shaped, and baked separately. By 3 or 4 in the morning, the dough was ready for kneading, the most physically demanding stage. The baker would divide the dough into manageable portions, each weighing several pounds, and work it on the kneading board. This involved pressing, folding, and turning the dough repeatedly for up to an hour per batch, building the gluten structure to give the bread its texture. The repetitive motion strained the arms, shoulders, and back, and in the dim, flickering light of the bakehouse, the baker's focus was tested as he fought to stay awake. Once kneaded, the dough was scaled into loaves, a process that involved cutting and weighing each portion to ensure uniformity. A standard quartern loaf, the most common size, weighed 4 pounds after baking and required about 4.5 pounds of dough to account for water loss. The baker used a balance scale, adjusting small weights with precision, a task that could take an hour for a large batch. Shaping the loaves came next, with each portion rolled and tucked by hand to form a smooth, oval shape. This was done on the floured board, the baker's fingers moving methodically to avoid tearing the dough. The shaped loaves were placed on wooden peels or trays, dusted with flour to prevent sticking, and left for a second, shorter proof to rise slightly before baking. Baking itself was a critical stage, requiring constant attention. The baker slid the loaves into the oven using the long-handled peel, arranging them carefully to maximize space without touching, as this could cause uneven baking. The oven's heat was uneven, hotter near the firebox and cooler at the edges, so the baker had to rotate the loaves midway through to ensure consistent browning. Baking a batch took about an hour, during which the bakehouse filled with the warm, yeasty aroma of bread. A brief moment of sensory relief in an otherwise grueling night. The baker would check the loaves by tapping their bottoms. A hollow sound indicated they were done. Removing them was a delicate operation, as the hot loaves could burn unprotected hands, and dropping one meant starting over. Once baked, the loaves were set on racks to cool, but not too long, as customers preferred warm bread. By 6 in the morning, the baker might begin deliveries, loading loaves into baskets or a cart for street sales or shop distribution. In urban areas, this meant navigating crowded, muddy streets, dodging horse-drawn carriages and early workers. The baker's day didn't end until the last loaf was sold, often around noon or later, leaving him just a few hours to rest before the cycle began again. This relentless routine, repeated 6 days a week, defined the baker's life, a steady drumbeat of labor that offered little variation or respite. The tools of the trade were simple but essential: each adding to the repetitive nature of the work. The kneading trough, often made of oak or elm, was heavy and hard to clean, requiring regular scrubbing to prevent mold. The peel, a flat wooden shovel, was worn smooth from years of use, its handle polished by countless grips. Scales and weights, made of iron or brass, were calibrated daily to ensure accuracy, a tedious task that could delay the process if a weight was misplaced. The oven itself, built of brick and mortar, required constant maintenance, as cracks from heat expansion could ruin the bake. These tools, combined with the baker's skill, produced the bread that fed a nation, but at the cost of his health and well-being. This unending cycle of mixing, kneading, baking, and selling was the backbone of the Victorian bakery, a process so routine it could lull the mind into a haze. As we move to the next part, we'll explore the specific types of bread and their cultural significance. But for now, let the steady cadence of these details guide you closer to rest. In the Victorian era, bread was more than just food. It was a symbol of survival, social status, and cultural identity across Britain's diverse regions and classes. The types of bread produced in bakehouses varied widely, each with its own method of preparation, ingredients, and role in daily life, from the standard quartern loaf that fed the working poor to the delicate rolls. Favored by the affluent, the baker's output reflected the rigid hierarchies of society while remaining a constant in every household. This part explores the monotonous details of the different breads baked in Victorian bakehouses, their painstaking production processes, and the cultural weight they carried, all delivered in a calm, repetitive tone to guide you toward sleep. The most common bread was the quartern loaf, a 4-pound staple that dominated the diets of the working class. Made from coarse, second-grade flour, it was heavy, dense, and slightly grayish due to the inclusion of bran and sometimes adulterants like alum or chalk. The quartern loaf was baked in large batches, with bakers producing dozens at a time to meet the relentless demand of urban populations. The process began with mixing the dough, as described earlier, using flour, water, yeast, and salt in a wooden trough. After kneading, the dough was divided into precise portions, each weighed on a balance scale to ensure it met the standard 4-pound weight post-baking. Shaping was a quick but careful task. The baker rolled each portion into an oval, tucking the edges to create a smooth surface, then placed it on a floured peel for the oven. Baking took about an hour in the brick oven, with the baker rotating the loaves to avoid hot spots. Once cooled, these loaves were sold for around 4 pence, affordable for laborers, who might spend a third of their weekly wages on bread alone. Its cultural significance lay in its ubiquity. It was the foundation of meals, often eaten with dripping, cheese, or thin soup, sustaining families through long factory shifts. For the middle and upper classes, finer breads were available made from whiter, more expensive flour that required additional milling to remove bran. The cottage loaf, recognizable by its distinctive shape, a smaller, round atop a larger one, was a favorite in wealthier households. Creating this loaf was a meticulous process that added to the baker's workload. After mixing a dough with finer flour, the baker divided it into 2 portions, one larger for the base, one smaller for the top. Each was shaped by hand. The smaller ball pressed gently into the center of the larger one, then slashed with a knife to allow expansion during baking. The cottage loaf required a slightly cooler oven, around 400 degrees Fahrenheit, to prevent the delicate flour from burning, and the baker had to watch closely to ensure the top didn't separate. This bread, priced at 6 to 8 pence, was often served at breakfast or tea, spread with butter or jam, symbolizing modest prosperity in a society obsessed with appearances. Rolls were another middle-class staple, smaller and softer than standard loaves, often eaten fresh with meals. These required a richer dough, sometimes enriched with milk or a small amount of sugar, which meant additional ingredients to measure and mix. The baker would knead this dough lightly to keep it tender, then shape it into small rounds or ovals, a task that demanded precision to ensure uniformity. Rolls baked quickly in about 20 minutes, but their small size meant the baker had to handle dozens at a time, placing them close together on the oven floor to maximize space. Their soft texture and pale crust made them a luxury compared to the quartern loaf, and they were often sold to hotels, restaurants, or wealthier households for a penny or two each. Culturally, rolls signified refinement, appearing on dining tables alongside fine china, a small but visible marker of status. In rural areas, regional breads added variety to the baker's repertoire, each with its own time-consuming method. In Scotland, bannocks were a traditional flatbread made from barley or oatmeal, mixed with water or buttermilk, and cooked on a griddle rather than an oven. The baker would heat the griddle over a fire, a slower process than oven baking, and flip the bannocks repeatedly to ensure even cooking. These were denser and cheaper than wheat bread, popular among rural poor who couldn't afford imported flour. In northern England, barm cakes, a soft, yeasty roll, were made with brewer's yeast and required careful fermentation to achieve their airy texture. The baker had to monitor the dough closely, as over-fermentation could make it too sour. These regional specialties were less common in urban bakehouses, but were sometimes produced for specific customers or festivals, adding yet another task to the baker's endless night. Specialty breads, like currant buns or saffron loaves, were reserved for holidays or wealthier clients, requiring extra ingredients and labor. Currant buns, popular at Easter or Christmas, involved adding dried fruit and spices like cinnamon to the dough, which the baker had to measure precisely to avoid overpowering the flavor. The fruit was often soaked in water to soften it, a step that added time, and the dough required gentle kneading to distribute the currants evenly. Saffron loaves, a luxury in places like Cornwall, used expensive saffron threads, which the baker crushed and steeped in warm water before adding to the mix. These loaves were baked slowly to preserve the delicate flavor, with the baker adjusting the oven's dampers to control heat. Priced at a shilling or more, these breads were rare treats, symbolizing festivity or wealth, and their production was a source of pride for skilled bakers, despite the extra effort. Adulteration, as mentioned in Part 1, affected the types of bread produced, particularly for the poor. Quartern loaves were often bulked up with potato flour, chalk, or even plaster to cut costs, a process that required the baker to mix these additives discreetly to avoid detection. This practice was widespread in urban areas, where competition drove prices down, and bakers faced pressure to produce more with less. The cultural impact was significant. Bread, meant to be a wholesome staple, became a source of mistrust, with newspapers and reformers exposing scandals that eroded public faith. The Food Adulteration Act of 1860 aimed to curb these practices, but enforcement was weak, and bakers continued adding fillers, handling potentially harmful substances that irritated their skin and lungs. The cultural role of bread extended beyond the kitchen table into social rituals and traditions. Bread was central to charity, with organizations like the church or local philanthropists distributing loaves to the poor. often baked by the same overworked bakers in urban bakehouses. In religious settings, bread took on symbolic importance, from the plain wafers used in communion to the hot cross buns of Good Friday, which required the baker to score a cross into the dough before baking, a small but precise task. Bread also appeared in folklore and superstitions. For example, a loaf baked on Christmas Eve was believed to never go moldy, and bakers might be asked to produce these with extra care, adding to their workload during busy seasons. The baker's role in producing these varied breads was a source of both pride and exhaustion. Each type required specific techniques, timings, and tools, all performed in the same cramped, sweltering bakehouse under the dim glow of gas lamps. The quartern loaf demanded brute strength for kneading large batches, while rolls and specialty breads called for delicate handling, testing the baker's versatility despite his fatigue. The oven, always a challenge, had to be adjusted for each bread type. Hotter for dense loaves, cooler for rolls, requiring constant vigilance. The baker's tools, from the peel to the trough, were used repeatedly, cleaned and reused, their worn surfaces a testament to years of repetitive labor. Socially, bread shaped community interactions. Bakers often bartered loaves for goods or services, especially in poorer neighborhoods where cash was scarce. Street vendors, many of them children, sold the baker's wares, shouting in the early morning to attract customers, their cries blending into the city's soundscape. Bread riots, though less common than in earlier centuries, still erupted when prices spiked, reflecting its critical role in survival. For the baker, these pressures meant constant production under scrutiny, with no room for error in a trade where a single bad batch could ruin a day's earnings. This endless cycle of mixing, shaping, and baking different breads, each with its own demands, defined the Victorian baker's world. The quartern loaf, cottage loaf, rolls, and regional specialties were more than food. They were markers of class, tradition, and survival, baked by hands worn from years of toil. As we move to the next part, we'll explore the bakehouse itself, its layout, equipment, and the suffocating environment that shaped the baker's daily grind. But for now, let these repetitive details lull you deeper into calm. The Victorian bakehouse was the heart of a baker's world, a confined, sweltering space where every loaf was crafted through hours of repetitive labor, typically located in the basement of a shop or tenement. These workspaces were designed for function over comfort, prioritizing cheap rent and heat, retention over the well-being of those toiling within. The environment was harsh, filled with dust, fumes, and relentless heat, shaping the baker's daily experience in ways that were both monotonous and hazardous. This part delves into the minute details of the bakehouse's layout, equipment, and the oppressive conditions that defined the Victorian baker's life, presented in a steady, soothing tone to guide you toward sleep. Most urban bakehouses were small, often no larger than 10 by 15 feet, with low ceilings that trapped heat and made the air heavy. The walls, usually bare brick or plaster, were stained with soot and flour, their surfaces damp from condensation, caused by the contrast between the hot oven and the cool, often leaky basement. Floors were packed earth or rough stone, uneven and slippery from spilled water or dough, requiring the baker to move carefully to avoid tripping during the long night shifts. A single small window, if present, was often high on the wall, caked with grime and offering little ventilation or natural light. Instead, illumination came from oil lamps or early gas lights, which flickered dimly and added their own smoky haze to the air. These lamps had to be refilled or adjusted regularly, a minor but constant task that interrupted the baker's rhythm. The centerpiece of the bakehouse was the brick oven, a massive structure built into one wall, often 6 feet wide and deep, with a domed interior designed to hold heat. Its firebox, located below or to the side, was fed with coal or wood, which the baker shoveled in throughout the night to maintain a consistent temperature of around 400 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Stoking the fire was a repetitive chore, requiring the baker to haul heavy buckets of coal or split logs, each weighing up to 20 pounds. From a storage corner to the oven, the firebox emitted a constant glow, casting long shadows that danced across the flour-dusted walls, while the smoke, if not properly vented, stung the baker's eyes and throat. Cleaning the oven was another tedious task. Before baking, the baker swept out ash and embers with a long pole called a scuffle, ensuring no debris contaminated the loaves, a process that could take 15 minutes and left his hands blistered. The kneading trough, a large wooden box about 6 feet long and 2 feet deep, sat at the center of the room, its surface worn smooth from years of use. Before each batch, the baker scraped it clean with a metal blade to remove dried dough, a task that required elbow grease and patience, as bits often stuck stubbornly to the wood. The trough's weight made it immovable, so the baker worked around it, leaning over to mix and knead, which strained his back and shoulders over time. Nearby, a wooden kneading board, often an extension of the trough, was dusted with flour to prevent sticking during shaping. This board, too, required regular cleaning, as flour buildup could harbor pests like cockroaches or mice, which were common in the damp, food-rich environment. Other equipment included the peel, a long-handled wooden shovel used to slide loaves into and out of the oven. Its flat blade, about 3 feet wide, was polished from repeated use, but its weight made it cumbersome, especially when maneuvering hot loaves. The baker also used a balance scale with iron weights to portion dough, a task repeated dozens of times per batch to ensure each loaf met the standard weight. These weights, ranging from 1/4 pound to 4 pounds, were stored in a wooden box that the baker had to dust off regularly to keep accurate. A water bucket, often a chipped wooden or tin vessel, sat in a corner, its contents used for mixing dough and cleaning tools, though it was rarely fresh by the end of the night. Shelves or hooks held smaller tools like knives for scoring loaves, brushes for dusting flour, and cloths for covering dough, all of which needed constant tidying to maintain order in the cramped space. The air in the bakehouse was a constant challenge, thick with flour dust that rose in clouds during mixing and settled on every surface, including the baker's skin and clothes. This dust irritated the lungs, contributing to baker's asthma, a chronic condition that caused wheezing and shortness of breath, worsening with each year of exposure. The heat from the oven made the room stifling, with temperatures often reaching 90 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, even in winter. In summer, the heat was unbearable, causing sweat to drip into the dough or onto the baker's arms, mixing with flour to form a sticky paste. Ventilation was minimal. The small window or vent, if it existed, did little to clear the air, and opening it in winter let in freezing drafts that could affect the dough's rise. Carbon monoxide from the coal fire posed a silent threat, causing dizziness or headaches if the chimney was clogged, a common issue in poorly maintained bakehouses. Sanitation was another persistent problem. The damp, warm environment attracted rodents and insects, which scurried across the floor or nested in flour sacks. The baker had to check supplies constantly, shaking sacks to dislodge pests, or setting traps that needed emptying, a grim task that added to his workload. Water, often drawn from contaminated urban sources, introduced bacteria that could spoil dough or sicken customers. Though the baking process usually killed most pathogens, the baker himself, working long hours with little time to wash, contributed to the grime. His hands, caked with dough, were cleaned only with a quick rinse in the same bucket used for mixing. Clothing, too, was rarely changed during the week, as bakers lived in poverty and owned few garments, so their aprons and shirts became stiff with flour and sweat. The bakehouse's layout forced the baker to move in a predictable pattern, from trough to board, board to scale, scale to oven, and back again, dozens of times per night. This repetitive motion, combined with the heavy lifting of flour sacks, coal, and water, led to chronic physical ailments. Back pain was universal, caused by stooping over the trough or carrying heavy loads up narrow basement stairs. Joint inflammation, particularly in the knees and elbows, developed from kneeling to stoke the fire or reaching into the oven. Burns were common, as the baker's hands and arms brushed against the hot oven mouth or splashed with boiling water during cleaning. Over time, these injuries accumulated, leaving bakers with permanent scars, stooped postures, and weakened bodies by their 40s. The sensory experience of the bakehouse was unchanging, adding to its monotonous atmosphere. The smell was a mix of yeast, burning coal, and warm bread, comforting at first, but cloying after hours of exposure. The soundscape included the crackle of the fire, the scrape of the peel against the oven floor, and the occasional drip of water from a leaky ceiling, punctuated by the baker's own coughs or sighs. The dim light strained the eyes, making it hard to spot imperfections in the dough or equipment, and the constant heat sapped energy, leaving the baker in a state of perpetual exhaustion. Sleep, when possible, was taken in brief snatches, often lying on a flour sack atop the kneading board, with the oven's warmth lulling the baker into a fitful doze. Socially, the bakehouse isolated the baker from the outside world. Working through the night, he rarely saw daylight, contributing to a pallid complexion and vitamin deficiencies. Interaction was limited to brief exchanges with apprentices, delivery boys, or shopkeepers, often curt due to fatigue. The bakehouse was a solitary domain, its walls enclosing the baker in a cycle of labor that offered little escape. Even in larger bakehouses with multiple workers, conversation was minimal, as each man focused on his tasks to meet the morning deadline. The master baker, if present, might oversee operations but often left the night work to journeymen, adding to their sense of abandonment in the stifling space. By the late Victorian era, some larger bakeries adopted steam-powered ovens or mechanical mixers, but these were rare in small independent bakehouses. The traditional setup persisted, with its brick oven, wooden trough, and manual labor, unchanged for decades. This lack of progress trapped bakers in a time warp, their methods rooted in centuries old practices despite the industrial advances around them. The bakehouse, then, was not just a workplace but a microcosm of the Victorian era's inequalities, where the poor toiled in obscurity to feed the masses, their efforts unnoticed except in the bread on every table. This unvarying environment, with its heat, dust, and repetitive tasks, defined the baker's existence, a world of quiet endurance beneath the city's surface. As we continue in the next part, we'll explore the lives of the apprentices and journeymen who worked alongside the baker, their roles, and the hardships they faced. But for now, let the steady hum of these details guide you deeper into rest. The Victorian bakehouse was not just the domain of the master baker, but also of apprentices and journeymen. the unsung laborers who toiled alongside him in the dim, flour-dusted basements. These workers, often young and drawn from the working class, faced the same grueling conditions as their masters, but with less control, and even fewer rewards. Their lives were defined by long hours, physical exhaustion, and the constant pressure to learn and perform in an unforgiving environment. This part explores the repetitive routines, hardships, and fleeting hopes of apprentices and journeyman bakers, detailing their roles and the toll their work took on body and spirit, all narrated in a steady, soothing tone to lull you into rest. Apprentices were typically boys as young as 12 or 13, bound to a master baker for several years, often until they reached 21. These lads came from poor families, sometimes orphans or children of laborers, sent to the trade to learn a skill and ease the burden on their households. The apprenticeship was formalized through indentures, legal agreements that promised training in exchange for labor, but in practice, it was often exploitative. The apprentice's day began around 10 or 11 at night, when he arrived at the bakehouse to assist with the night's work. His tasks were menial but essential, hauling heavy flour sacks, fetching water from pumps, or stoking the oven fire with coal or wood. Each sack, weighing up to 280 pounds, was a struggle for a boy's slight frame, requiring him to drag or roll it across the uneven floor, often scraping his hands or bruising his shoulders. Water buckets, filled from often dirty urban wells, were carried up and down narrow stairs, splashing onto his clothes and chilling him in winter. The apprentice also cleaned the bakehouse, scraping dried dough from the kneading trough with a blunt blade, a task that took strength and patience, as the sticky residue clung stubbornly to the wood. He swept the flour-dusted floor, stirring up clouds that irritated his eyes and lungs, and emptied traps of the rodents that scurried through the basement, a grim chore that could turn his stomach. These tasks were repeated nightly with little variation, teaching the boy the bakehouse's rhythm, but offering no respite from its demands. In return for his labor, the apprentice received room and board, often just a cot in a corner of the bakehouse or a shared attic above the shop, and meager wages, sometimes as little as 2 shillings a week. Food was basic: bread from the day's bake, perhaps with dripping or a thin soup, barely enough to sustain the growing boy through his exhausting shifts. Learning the craft was a slow process, as masters were often too busy or unwilling to teach. The apprentice observed the journeyman or master mixing dough, watching how flour, water, yeast, and salt were combined in the trough. He might be allowed to stir the mixture, his arms aching as he pushed through the sticky mass, or to knead small portions under supervision, learning to feel the dough's texture. Mistakes were costly. A poorly mixed batch could ruin dozens of loaves, earning the boy a sharp rebuke or even a cuff to the ear. Over time, he was trusted with shaping loaves, rolling dough into ovals for quartern loaves, or smaller rounds for rolls, his fingers learning the precise motions through endless repetition. Baking itself was rarely entrusted to apprentices, as the oven's heat and timing required experience, but he might slide loaves in or out with the peel, burning his hands if he misjudged the distance. Journeymen, the next rung up, were bakers who had completed their apprenticeship, but worked for wages rather than owning a bakehouse. Typically, in their 20s or 30s, they formed the backbone of the trade, performing the bulk of the skilled labor. Their workday mirrored the master's, starting late at night and ending in the early afternoon, often totaling 17 hours. The journeyman mixed and kneaded large batches of dough, his arms moving rhythmically for hours, folding and pressing until the dough was smooth. He scaled and shaped loaves with practiced speed, weighing each portion on the balance scale to ensure uniformity, a task that required focus despite the numbing repetition. Baking was his responsibility, sliding loaves into the oven with the peel, rotating them to avoid burning, and tapping each to check for the hollow sound of doneness. The heat singed his forearms, leaving scars that marked his years in the trade. The journeyman's wages, around 15 to 20 shillings a week, were barely enough to live on, especially in cities like London where rents were high. Many lived in crowded tenements near the Bakehouse, sharing rooms with other workers to save money. Their diet was little better than the apprentices', relying on the bakery's output, supplemented by cheap cuts of meat or vegetables when funds allowed. Like the master, journeymen suffered from the bakehouse's environment. Flour dust clogged their lungs, leading to chronic coughs or baker's asthma, while the heat and heavy lifting caused back pain and joint inflammation. Burns and blisters were constant, as were headaches from coal fumes or lack of sleep, as they snatched rest on flour sacks during dough proving times. Socially, apprentices and journeymen were bound by the bakehouse's isolation. Apprentices, often far from family, formed bonds with their fellow workers, but the age gap and hierarchy limited camaraderie. Journeymen, hardened by years of toil, were often too tired to socialize, though they might gather at a public house on their half-day off, drinking ale to dull the aches of their labor. These gatherings were also where journeymen sought new work, as jobs were unstable. A slow season or a master's displeasure could mean dismissal. Unions, emerging in the 1840s, offered some hope, with groups like the Amalgamated Union of Operative Bakers, advocating for shorter hours and better pay. Strikes occurred, particularly in London, but masters resisted, and journeymen faced the risk of unemployment for joining such efforts. The physical toll on these workers was severe. Apprentices, still growing, developed stooped postures from lifting heavy loads or hunching over troughs. Malnutrition was common, as their diet lacked variety, weakening their immune systems and making them prone to infections like tuberculosis, rampant in the damp bakehouse. Journeymen, in their prime, aged prematurely, their faces lined and hands gnarled from repetitive tasks. Both groups faced the same occupational hazards as the master: respiratory issues from flour dust, burns from the oven, and exhaustion from sleepless nights. Medical care was scarce, as their wages couldn't cover doctors' fees, and home remedies like liniments for sore muscles or vinegar for burns were all they could afford. Culturally, apprentices and journeymen were invisible, their labor taken for granted by the customers who bought their bread. Yet their work was critical, feeding cities through countless loaves produced under grueling conditions. Apprentices dreamed of becoming journeymen, and journeymen hoped to save enough to open their own bakehouses, though few succeeded due to the trade's low margins and high startup costs. This faint hope kept them going, even as the daily grind wore them down. In rural areas, apprentices might work in smaller, less intense bakehouses, but the urban majority faced the full weight of industrial demand, their youth and strength consumed by the city's hunger for bread. The bakehouse hierarchy was rigid. Apprentices answered to journeymen, who in turn obeyed the master, creating a chain of command that left little room for initiative. Training was less about mentorship and more about survival, with skills passed down through observation and trial rather than formal instruction. For the apprentice, every night was a test of endurance, learning through repetition until the motions of mixing, kneading, and shaping became second nature. The journeyman, meanwhile, bore the pressure of producing consistent loaves, knowing that any error could cost his job. Both were trapped in the bakehouse's cycle, their lives dictated by the oven's heat and the dough's rise. This unceasing routine, with its endless tasks and stifling environment, shaped the lives of apprentices and journeymen, binding them to a trade that offered little reward beyond the bread they baked. As we move to the next part, we'll explore the economics of the baking trade, including wages, costs, and the pressures of competition. But for now, let the steady rhythm of these details guide you closer to sleep. The Victorian baking trade was a precarious balance of survival and struggle, where bakers, apprentices, and journeymen worked tirelessly to produce bread that fed millions, yet faced relentless economic pressures that shaped their lives. In an era of rapid industrialization and urban growth, the demand for bread was insatiable, but the financial realities of the trade were harsh, with low wages, high costs, and fierce competition squeezing profits and livelihoods. This part examines the monotonous economic details of running a bakehouse, from ingredient costs to labor expenses, and the broader market forces that kept bakers trapped in a cycle of toil, narrated in a calm, repetitive tone to ease you into rest. The primary expense for any bakehouse was flour, the backbone of bread production. In the mid-19th century, a sack of flour, weighing 280 pounds, cost between 30 and 50 shillings. Depending on quality and market fluctuations, wheat prices varied with harvests and imports, rising sharply during poor seasons or when trade disruptions, like the Crimean War, limited foreign grain supplies. A small urban bakehouse, producing 100 quartern loaves daily, might use 2 sacks per week, costing up to £5, a significant portion of the budget. The baker had to haggle with millers or suppliers, often paying up front, which strained cash flow. Lower-grade flour, used for the working-class quartern loaf, was cheaper but less reliable, prone to spoilage or adulteration, forcing the baker to inspect each sack meticulously, sifting through for lumps or pests in a time-consuming ritual. Other ingredients added to the costs. Yeast, whether homemade or bought from brewers, cost about £1 per gallon, with a small bakehouse needing several gallons weekly. Salt, essential for flavor, was relatively cheap at a few pence per pound, but the baker needed large quantities, grinding it by hand to ensure even distribution. Water, while free from public pumps, required labor to fetch, as apprentices hauled heavy buckets from distant wells, sometimes queuing in the cold for access. Fuel for the oven, coal or wood, was another major expense. Coal, increasingly common in cities, cost about 2 shillings per hundredweight, and a bakehouse might burn through several hundredweight daily to keep the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood was pricier and harder to source, often costing double, and required chopping into smaller pieces, adding to the workload. Labor was the next significant cost. A journeyman baker earned 15 to 20 shillings a week, while apprentices received 2 to 5 shillings, plus room and board. A small bakehouse might employ 1 journeyman and 1 or 2 apprentices, totaling a weekly wage bill of about 25 shillings. Masters, who owned the bakehouse, took home slightly more but bore the risk of losses. Many masters worked alongside their employees, unable to afford extra hands, which meant their income barely exceeded a journeyman's after expenses. In larger bakeries, with multiple journeymen, costs could climb to several pounds weekly, a heavy burden given the slim profit margins. Wages were paid in cash, often on Saturday evenings, requiring the master to keep coins on hand, a task that meant trips to banks or moneylenders in an era before widespread banking services. The bakehouse itself was a fixed cost. Rent for a basement space in a city like London ranged from £10 to £20 per year, a modest sum compared to retail shops, but still significant for a small operation. The oven and equipment, like the kneading trough and peels, were one-time investments but required maintenance. A brick oven, costing £50 to build, needed regular repairs for cracks caused by heat expansion, while wooden tools wore out and needed replacing every few years. Gas lighting, if installed, added a small but ongoing expense, as did lamp oil for older setups. These costs, while predictable, chipped away at profits, leaving little room for savings or improvements. Revenue came from selling bread, but prices were constrained by competition and customer expectations. A quartern loaf, the staple for the working class, sold for 4 to 6 pence, yielding a gross income of about £2 for 100 loaves. Rolls at a penny each, and specialty breads like cottage loaves or currant buns at 6 to 12 pence brought higher margins but smaller volumes. A typical small bakehouse might earn £5 to £7 weekly, but after subtracting flour, fuel, labor, and rent, the net profit was often less than £1. Adulteration, as mentioned earlier, was a common way to stretch supplies and boost margins, with bakers adding chalk, alum, or potato flour to dough. This practice, while profitable, carried risks, as customers grew wary and reformers pushed for inspections, leading to fines or reputational damage. Competition was fierce, especially in urban areas where bakehouses lined every street. In London alone, thousands of small bakeries vied for customers, driving prices down and forcing bakers to work longer hours to maintain output. Larger bakeries, adopting steam-powered ovens by the 1870s, could produce bread faster and cheaper, undercutting smaller operations. These factories employed dozens of workers and used mechanical mixers, reducing labor costs but threatening the traditional bakehouse. Small bakers, unable to afford such technology, relied on manual labor and cut corners where possible, further fueling the cycle of adulteration and low wages. Street vendors, often selling day-old bread at a discount, added to the pressure, as did grocers who began stocking factory-made loaves later in the century. The economic precariousness extended to the workers. Journeymen faced job insecurity, as a slow week or a master's displeasure could mean dismissal. Apprentices, bound by indentures, had no choice but to endure. Their low-wage masters, while better off, were rarely wealthy. Many struggled to pay suppliers or rent, and bankruptcy was a constant threat. Moneylenders, charging high interest, were a last resort, trapping bakers in debt. The trade's instability was compounded by seasonal fluctuations. Winter increased fuel costs, while summer brought spoilage risks, both eating into profits. Bread riots, though rare, could erupt when prices rose, as the poor depended on affordable loaves, putting pressure on bakers to keep prices low despite rising costs. Socially, the economics shaped the bakehouse's culture. Journeymen and apprentices worked for survival, not ambition, their wages barely covering rent and food. Public houses served as informal job markets, where bakers shared tips on better-paying masters or planned strikes. Through emerging unions, the Amalgamated Union of Operative Bakers, formed in the 1840s, pushed for a 10-hour workday and higher wages, but strikes often failed, as masters hired desperate replacements. These efforts, while bold, rarely changed the trade's structure, leaving workers to toil in the same conditions year after year. Apprentices, dreaming of becoming journeymen, and journeymen, hoping to own a bakehouse, faced slim odds, as savings were eaten up by daily expenses. The economic grind was relentless. Each night, the baker calculated costs mentally, weighing flour against sales, hoping to break even. Deliveries, often done by apprentices or journeymen, involved trudging through streets with heavy baskets, bartering loaves for goods in poorer neighborhoods where cash was scarce. Bookkeeping, if done at all, was rudimentary, with masters scribbling sales in a ledger by lamplight, a task that added to the night's burdens. Taxes, though minimal, and licensing fees for selling bread further strained budgets, as did occasional fines for adulteration or violating weights and measures laws, which required loaves to meet standard sizes. By the late Victorian era, technological advances like steam ovens and mechanical mixers began to shift the trade. But for most small bakehouses, the economic realities remained unchanged. The baker's life was a repetitive cycle of buying supplies, producing bread, and selling it for just enough to start again. This constant struggle, hidden behind the warm loaves on every table, defined the trade's quiet endurance. As we move to the next part, we'll explore the health and safety hazards beyond the bakehouse environment, including diseases and accidents that plagued bakers. But for now, let the steady hum of these economic details guide you deeper into calm. The Victorian bakehouse was a place of unrelenting toil, where bakers, apprentices, and journeymen faced not only physical exhaustion but also a range of health and safety hazards that made their trade one of the most dangerous of the era. Beyond the stifling environment described earlier, the daily grind exposed workers to diseases, injuries, and chronic conditions that shortened lives and left lasting marks. These risks, often ignored by society, were an inescapable part of the baker's routine, woven into the repetitive tasks of mixing, kneading, and baking. This part explores the monotonous details of these hazards, from respiratory ailments to burns and infections, narrated in a steady, soothing tone to guide you gently toward sleep. The most pervasive health threat was flour dust, a constant presence in the bakehouse. Every time a baker poured flour into the kneading trough or sifted it to remove lumps, fine particles filled the air, settling on surfaces and lingering in the lungs. This dust caused a condition known as baker's asthma or baker's lung, a chronic respiratory illness marked by coughing, wheezing, and shortness of breath. The symptoms worsened over years as the baker inhaled dust night after night, with no masks or protective gear to shield him. In poorly ventilated basements, the dust was inescapable, coating the throat and eyes, causing irritation that never fully subsided. Medical reports from the 1850s noted that bakers were among the most likely tradesmen to develop lung complaints, with many becoming incapacitated by their 40s, unable to work but too poor to seek treatment. The heat of the bakehouse compounded these issues. The brick oven, kept at 400 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, made the air stifling, often exceeding 90 degrees in the cramped space. This heat caused constant sweating, which mixed with flour to form a pasty residue on the skin, clogging pores and leading to rashes or infections. Bakers, unable to wash frequently due to limited water and time, developed skin conditions like eczema or boils, particularly on their hands and arms, which were constantly submerged in dough or exposed to heat. The sudden shift from the hot bakehouse to the cold, damp streets during deliveries led to rheumatic fever, a painful condition that inflamed joints and weakened the heart, further reducing life expectancy. Burns were a daily risk. The oven's mouth, glowing with heat, was a hazard every time the baker used the peel to slide loaves in or out. A moment's inattention could result in scorched hands or forearms, leaving red, blistered skin that took weeks to heal. Hot water, used to clean the trough or tools, posed another danger, as spills could scald the baker or apprentices fetching buckets. The lack of protective gear, perhaps just a thin cloth or worn mittens, meant burns were inevitable, with scars accumulating over years. Severe burns could become infected, especially in the unsanitary bakehouse, where dirt and dough residue coated every surface. Infections like erysipelas, a bacterial skin condition, were common, causing painful swelling and fever, and could be fatal without proper care, which few bakers could afford. The bakehouse's poor sanitation fostered disease. Rodents and insects, attracted by flour and crumbs, carried bacteria that could contaminate dough or water. Bakers, working with unwashed hands in a damp environment, spread germs to the bread, which was then sold to customers, contributing to outbreaks of cholera or typhoid in urban areas. The bakers themselves were vulnerable to tuberculosis, known as consumption, which thrived in the warm, moist air of the bakehouse. Weakened by poor diet and lack of sleep, their immune systems struggled to fight infections, and many succumbed in their 30s or 40s. Medical journals of the time reported that bakers had one of the highest mortality rates among trades, with tuberculosis and pneumonia listed as leading causes. Physical injuries from the bakehouse's demands were relentless. Kneading heavy dough for hours strained muscles and joints, leading to chronic back pain and arthritis. Lifting flour sacks, weighing up to 280 pounds, caused hernias or spinal injuries, especially for apprentices whose young bodies were not yet strong enough for such loads. The uneven, slippery floors posed a risk of falls, particularly when carrying buckets or baskets of loaves, resulting in sprains or broken bones. These injuries, untreated due to lack of funds, often left bakers permanently impaired, unable to continue in the trade, but with no other skills to fall back on. Adulteration, a common practice to cut costs, introduced additional health risks. Handling alum, chalk, or other additives irritated the skin and lungs, causing rashes or coughing fits. Alum, used to whiten bread, was particularly harmful, leading to digestive issues for both bakers and consumers when ingested over time. Mixing these substances required care to avoid detection, adding stress to the baker's routine, as exposure could lead to fines or public shaming. The constant handling of flour, already a respiratory hazard, was worsened by these additives, which were often ground into fine powders that mingled with the dust in the air. Sleep deprivation was another silent killer. Bakers worked 17-hour shifts, snatching brief naps on flour sacks during dough proving times, rarely getting more than 4 hours of rest. This chronic exhaustion weakened their bodies, making them prone to accidents and illnesses. It also dulled their minds, increasing the risk of errors like dropping loaves or misjudging the oven's heat, which could waste an entire batch and anger the master. Over time, lack of sleep led to heart palpitations, anxiety, and even seizures, as noted in medical studies of the 1860s, which described bakers as among the most overworked tradesmen. The psychological toll was equally heavy. The isolation of the bakehouse, combined with relentless pressure to produce, left bakers and their workers feeling trapped. Apprentices, bound by indentures, had no escape, while journeymen faced the constant threat of unemployment. The repetitive nature of the work, mixing, kneading, baking, day after day, dulled the mind, offering no intellectual stimulation or hope for advancement. Public houses, where bakers gathered on their half-day off, became outlets for frustration, but heavy drinking, common among journeymen, worsened health and drained wages, perpetuating the cycle of poverty. Safety regulations were virtually non-existent, while the Factory Acts of the 1830s and 1840s limited hours for some trades. Baking was largely exempt, as it was considered a domestic industry. Inspections were rare, and even when they occurred, bakers could hide unsanitary conditions or adulterated ingredients. The Food Adulteration Act of 1860 aimed to curb harmful practices, but enforcement was weak, and fines were often small enough to be worth risking. Unions, like the Amalgamated Union of Operative Bakers, pushed for better conditions, but their influence was limited, and strikes rarely succeeded in changing the trade's structure. The cumulative effect of these hazards was a shortened lifespan. Bakers rarely lived past their 50s, their bodies worn out by disease, injury, and exhaustion. Apprentices, starting young, faced decades of exposure to these risks, while journeymen, already weakened, had little hope of escaping the trade's toll. Yet their work was essential, producing the bread that sustained cities, a contribution unnoticed by the society that relied on them. The bakehouse, with its dangers hidden beneath the streets, was a microcosm of the Victorian era's disregard for the working poor. This unrelenting cycle of health risks and injuries, woven into the daily grind of baking, defined the lives of those in the trade. As we continue in the next part, we'll explore the social lives of bakers outside the bakehouse, their communities, and their rare moments of respite. But for now, let the steady rhythm of these details guide you closer to sleep. The life of a Victorian baker extended beyond the stifling walls of the bakehouse, but the social world they inhabited was shaped by the same relentless toil that defined their work. Trapped in a cycle of long hours and meager wages, bakers, apprentices, and journeymen had little time or energy for leisure. Yet they carved out small moments of connection in their communities. These interactions, often limited to brief exchanges or gatherings in public houses, offered fleeting relief from the monotony of their labor. This part explores the repetitive details of the bakers' social lives, their relationships, and the rare opportunities for rest, narrated in a calm, soothing tone to ease you into sleep. Bakers lived in a world apart, their nocturnal schedules isolating them from the daytime rhythms of Victorian society. Working from late evening to midday, they rarely saw sunlight, emerging from the bakehouse when most people were at work or asleep. This isolation meant their social circles were small, centered on the bakehouse and the immediate neighborhood. In urban areas like London or Manchester, bakers lived in cramped tenements near their workplaces, often sharing rooms with other workers to afford rent. These lodgings, in narrow streets lined with soot-stained buildings, were damp and overcrowded, with families or multiple workers squeezed into single rooms. The baker's home offered little comfort, its bare walls and sparse furnishings reflecting the poverty that kept him tethered to the trade. Interactions within the bakehouse were minimal, driven by the demands of work. Apprentices, journeymen, and the master worked side by side, but conversation was limited, as each focused on tasks like mixing dough, stoking the oven, or shaping loaves. The hierarchy was strict. Apprentices obeyed journeymen, who in turn followed the master's orders, leaving little room for camaraderie. An apprentice might ask a question about kneading technique, only to receive a curt reply, as exhaustion dulled tempers. The master, if present, was often preoccupied with costs or customers, adding to the sense of isolation. In larger bakehouses with multiple workers, the pace was even more relentless, with shouted instructions replacing conversation. the clatter of tools and crackle of the oven filling the silence. Outside the bakehouse, the baker's social life revolved around the neighborhood. In working-class districts, bakers were known figures, their shops or delivery rounds making them familiar to locals. Customers, often laborers or housewives, exchanged brief words when buying bread, commenting on its quality or price, but these interactions were transactional, rarely deepening into friendship. Bartering was common. A baker might trade loaves for vegetables or coal, especially in poorer areas where cash was scarce. These exchanges, repeated daily, formed a web of mutual dependence, but they offered little emotional connection, as both parties were preoccupied with survival. The public house was the heart of the baker's social world, particularly for journeymen. On their half-day off, typically Saturday evening, they gathered in smoky, gas-lit taverns, where wooden tables were crowded with workers from various trades. Here, bakers shared stories of their grueling shifts, complained about low wages, or swapped tips about better-paying masters. The public house was also a job market. Journeymen, facing unstable employment, networked to find new positions, their conversations blending with the clink of glasses and the hum of voices. Holly was cheap, costing a penny a pint, but drinking often drained what little money they had, worsening their poverty. Heavy drinking was common, as it dulled the aches of labor and the monotony of their lives, but it led to health issues like liver damage, adding to the trade's toll. Apprentices, too young to frequent pubs, had even fewer outlets. Often far from family, they found companionship with other apprentices, sharing complaints about their masters or dreams of escaping the trade. These bonds, formed in the bakehouse's dim corners or during brief breaks, were fragile, as competition for favor with the master could breed resentment. Some apprentices, especially orphans, lived in the bakehouse itself, sleeping on flour sacks or in attics, their social world limited to the workers around them. Older apprentices might sneak to the pub with journeymen, but their meager wages, 2 to 5 shillings a week, meant they could rarely afford more than a sip of shared ale. Community events offered rare moments of connection. Markets, held weekly in urban squares, drew bakers to sell bread or barter goods, allowing brief chats with vendors or customers. Festivals, like Christmas or Easter, brought extra work, baking currant buns or hot cross buns, but also chances to join celebrations. A baker might attend a church service, where bread played a symbolic role in communion, or join neighbors in street fairs, though exhaustion often kept them on the sidelines. Weddings or funerals in the neighborhood were communal affairs, and bakers might contribute loaves, reinforcing their role as providers. But these events were brief respites in a life of labor. Family life was strained by the trade's demands. Many bakers were unmarried, as their wages couldn't support a household, and their hours left little time for courtship. Those with families saw them sparingly, sleeping while their wives and children were awake. A baker's wife often helped in the shop, selling bread or keeping accounts, but the couple's interactions were practical, focused on survival. Children, if any, might become apprentices themselves, perpetuating the cycle. The baker's home, often a single room, was a place to collapse rather than connect, its silence broken only by the clatter of nearby factories or the cries of street vendors. Unions provided a glimmer of social and political engagement. The Amalgamated Union of Operative Bakers, active by the 1840s, organized meetings where journeymen discussed wages, hours, and conditions. These gatherings, held in rented rooms or pubs, were a chance to vent frustrations and plan strikes, though success was rare. Apprentices were rarely involved, their youth and indentures excluding them from union activities. but journeymen found purpose in the collective, however fleeting. Strikes, when they occurred, disrupted the neighborhood as customers scrambled for bread, but they rarely won lasting change, as masters hired replacements or waited out the unrest. The baker's social life was shaped by poverty. Wages of 15 to 20 shillings for journeymen, or less for apprentices, left little for leisure. Clothing was basic, often a single set of flour-stained trousers and a shirt, replaced only when worn out. Entertainment, like music halls or penny theaters, was a rare treat, as tickets cost more than most could spare. Reading, if the baker was literate, was limited to cheap newspapers or religious tracts, read by lamplight during brief breaks. Religion offered some solace. Many bakers attended Sunday services when their schedules allowed, finding community in hymns and sermons. But even this was curtailed by the need to prepare for the next night's work. The repetitive nature of their social interactions mirrored their work. Conversations in the pub circled back to the same complaints. Low pay, long hours, aching bodies. Neighborhood exchanges followed predictable patterns, centered on bread and survival. Even union meetings, while hopeful, repeated the same demands year after year, with little progress. This monotony, while draining, created a sense of familiarity, a small comfort in a harsh world. Bakers were bound to their communities by necessity, their role as bread providers tying them to neighbors, even if their lives remained solitary. By the late Victorian era, some bakers found new opportunities in growing cities, moving to new neighborhoods or joining larger bakeries. But for most, the social world remained unchanged. The bakehouse, the tenement, and the pub formed the boundaries of their existence, a cycle as unyielding as their labor. As we move to the next part, we'll explore the role of women in the baking trade, from shopkeepers to family helpers, and their contributions to the bakehouse. But for now, let the steady cadence of these social details guide you deeper into rest. The Victorian baking trade, while dominated by men in the bakehouse, relied heavily on women who played essential but often overlooked roles in keeping the business running. From managing the shop front to assisting with household duties, women were integral to the trade's survival. Their work marked by the same repetitive grind as the bakers, but with even less recognition. In an era where gender roles were rigidly defined, women connected to bakehouses navigated a world of labor and responsibility, their contributions woven into the daily rhythm of bread production. This part explores the monotonous details of women's roles in the baking trade, their tasks, and the challenges they faced, narrated in a calm, soothing tone to guide you gently toward sleep. In most small bakehouses, the baker's wife or female relatives were the backbone of the shop, the public face where bread was sold to customers. The shop, often a small room above or adjacent to the basement bakehouse, was a cramped space with wooden counters and shelves displaying the day's loaves. The woman's day began early, around 6 in the morning, when the first batches of bread were ready. She would arrange the quartern loaves, rolls, and occasional specialty breads like currant buns, dusting the shelves to keep them presentable. Each loaf was placed carefully, as appearance mattered to customers who judged quality by sight. The shop smelled of fresh bread, a contrast to the bakehouse's heat and dust. But the work was no less demanding, requiring constant attention to customers who streamed in from dawn to midday. Selling bread was a repetitive task, with the woman weighing loaves on a small scale to ensure accuracy, as customers were quick to complain about short weight. She handled coins, often sticky or dirty from laborers' hands, counting change with precision to avoid disputes. Prices were fixed, 4 to 6 pence for a quartern loaf, a penny for a roll. but haggling was common, especially in poorer neighborhoods, where customers bartered for day-old bread at a discount. The woman had to be firm yet polite, balancing customer goodwill with the need to protect slim profits. She kept a mental tally of sales, jotting figures in a ledger during lulls, a task that required basic literacy and arithmetic, skills not all possessed in an era of limited education for women. Beyond selling, women often managed the bakehouse's accounts, a tedious but critical job. Sitting by candlelight after the shop closed, they recorded expenses, flour, yeast, coal, and compared them to daily takings, ensuring the business stayed afloat. Mistakes could mean financial ruin, as suppliers demanded payment up front, and rent was due monthly. In larger bakehouses, where the master employed multiple workers, the woman might also calculate wages, counting out shillings for journeymen and apprentices, a task that added to her workload. If the family lived above the shop, she maintained the household, cooking meals from leftover bread and scraps, cleaning the cramped living space, and mending flour-stained clothes, all with little time for rest. In some cases, women assisted directly in the bakehouse, especially in family-run operations. They might prepare ingredients, measuring salt or fetching water, or shape rolls and buns, tasks that required less strength than kneading large batches of dough. Their hands moved quickly, rolling dough into small rounds or tucking edges for cottage loaves, repeating the motions dozens of times. This work, done in the bakehouse's heat and dust, exposed them to the same respiratory and skin issues as male bakers, including bakers' asthma and rashes from flour residue. Unlike men, they often juggled these tasks with childcare, bringing infants to the shop or bakehouse, where they slept in baskets amid the noise and warmth, adding to the woman's burden. Women also played a role in deliveries, particularly in rural areas or smaller towns. In urban settings, this was less common, as apprentices or journeymen handled street sales, but in villages, a baker's wife or daughter might carry baskets of bread to customers' homes or market stalls. This involved trudging through muddy lanes or cobbled streets, balancing heavy loads while dodging carts and crowds. Each delivery was a transaction, with the woman collecting pennies or bartering for goods like eggs or butter. Her interactions brief but repetitive, as she followed the same routes daily. In winter, the cold bit at her hands and feet, while summer brought sweat and fatigue, mirroring the physical toll of the bakehouse. The social world of these women was as limited as the men's. Their long hours, in the shop or bakehouse, left little time for leisure, and societal expectations restricted their movements. Unlike journeymen who gathered in public houses, women were rarely seen in such spaces, as it was considered improper. Instead, their social connections were with neighbors or customers, often other women who shared their struggles. Conversations at the shop counter, while brief, offered moments of camaraderie, as housewives swapped stories of hardship or recipes for stretching bread into meals. Church services, when time allowed, were another outlet, where women found community in hymns and charity work, often donating unsold loaves to the poor. The economic pressures of the baking trade fell heavily on women, with profits slim, often less than £1 a week after expenses. The families' survival depended on their frugality. They stretched every shilling, buying cheap ingredients for meals, or repairing clothes to avoid new purchases. If the master fell ill or the business faltered, the woman might take on more bakehouse tasks, learning to knead or bake to keep production going. Some widows continued running bakehouses after their husbands' deaths, a rare but challenging role that required mastering the trade's skills while facing skepticism from customers and suppliers who doubted a woman's ability. Health risks were a constant concern. Like male bakers, women in the bakehouse inhaled flour dust, risking respiratory issues, and suffered burns from handling hot trays or brushing against the oven. The shop's damp, poorly ventilated conditions fostered colds and infections, while the physical strain of lifting baskets or standing for hours caused back pain and swollen legs. Childbirth, common among married women, was dangerous with no maternity leave or medical support, and many returned to work days after delivery, their exhaustion deepening. Malnutrition, from a diet heavy in bread and little else, weakened their bodies, making them prone to diseases like tuberculosis, which spread easily in cramped living quarters. Despite these hardships, women's contributions were vital. The shop's success depended on their ability to charm customers, manage finances, and support the bakehouse's operations. In family-run businesses, their unpaid labor kept costs low, allowing the bakehouse to compete with larger factories. Yet their work was invisible to society, seen as an extension of domestic duties rather than skilled labor. This lack of recognition added to the monotony of their lives as they repeated the same tasks: selling, accounting, cleaning, day after day, with no hope of advancement. In larger cities, some women found work in factory bakeries, which emerged in the later Victorian era. These factories, using steam-powered ovens, employed women for lighter tasks like packaging bread or shaping rolls, but the pay was low, often less than 10 shillings a week, and conditions were as harsh as in small bakehouses. The rise of these factories threatened traditional bakehouses, forcing women to work harder to maintain the family business. Their efforts a quiet act of resilience in a changing world. This unceasing cycle of labor, from shop to home to bakehouse, defined the lives of women in the baking trade, their contributions essential yet unnoticed. As we move to the next part, we'll explore the technological changes that began to reshape the baking industry in the late Victorian era, but for now, let the steady rhythm of these details guide you deeper into sleep. The Victorian baking trade, for much of the 19th century, was rooted in traditional methods, with bakers relying on manual labor and simple tools to produce bread. However, as the era progressed, technological advancements began to reshape the industry, particularly in urban areas where demand for bread was relentless. These changes, while slow to reach small bakehouses, introduced new equipment and processes that altered the baker's daily grind, though not always for the better. This part explores the monotonous details of these technological shifts, from steam-powered ovens to mechanical mixers, and their impact on the baking trade, narrated in a calm, soothing tone to guide you gently toward sleep. For most of the Victorian period, the bakehouse operated much as it had for centuries, centered around the brick oven, wooden kneading trough, and manual labor. The oven, heated by wood or coal, required constant tending, with the baker shoveling fuel into the firebox to maintain a steady temperature of 400 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. The kneading trough, a heavy wooden box, was filled by hand, with the baker mixing flour, water, yeast, and salt using only his arms, a process that took 30 minutes per batch. Shaping loaves, weighing dough, and sliding bread into the oven with a wooden peel were all done manually. Each task repeated dozens of times nightly. These methods, while reliable, were labor-intensive, limiting output and tying bakers to long hours of physical toil. By the 1860s and 1870s, steam power began to transform larger bakeries, particularly in cities like London and Manchester. Steam ovens, introduced in industrial bakeries, were a significant departure from traditional brick ovens. These ovens used pipes to circulate steam, providing a more consistent heat that reduced the need for constant stoking. The baker no longer had to shovel coal or wood as frequently, though he still monitored the oven's temperature, adjusting valves to control steam flow, a task that required new skills but was less physically demanding. Steam ovens could bake larger batches, hundreds of loaves at once, compared to the dozens a brick oven could handle, allowing factories to produce bread faster and cheaper. However, installing a steam oven cost hundreds of pounds, far beyond the means of small bakehouse owners, who continued using their old ovens. Mechanical dough mixers were another innovation, appearing in larger bakeries by the late Victorian era. These machines, powered by steam or hand-cranked gears, consisted of large metal drums with rotating blades that mixed flour, water, and yeast. The baker loaded ingredients into the drum, turned a crank, or activated the steam engine, and let the machine do the work, reducing the need for hand kneading. A single batch, which took a baker 30 minutes to mix and knead manually, could be completed in 10 minutes with a mixer, saving time and effort. However, these machines were expensive, costing up to £50 and required maintenance. As gears jammed or blades dulled, small bakehouses, unable to afford them, relied on traditional troughs, where apprentices and journeymen continued their back-breaking kneading. Flour sifting machines, introduced in some factories, also eased labor. These devices, often hand-cranked, used screens to remove lumps and impurities from flour, a task that previously took apprentices hours of manual sifting. The baker or apprentice poured flour into a hopper, turned the crank, and collected the sifted flour in a bin below. A repetitive motion, but faster than hand sifting. Like mixers, these machines were rare in small bakehouses, where sifting remained a tedious chore, with flour dust filling the air and irritating lungs. The machines, while efficient, were costly and required space, a luxury most basement bakehouses lacked. These technological advancements were driven by the growing demand for bread in rapidly expanding cities. By the 1870s, Britain's urban population was booming, with millions relying on bread as their primary food source. Large bakeries, often called bread factories, emerged to meet this demand, employing dozens of workers and producing thousands of loaves daily. These factories used steam ovens and mixers to streamline production, undercutting small bakehouses on price. A factory could sell a quartern loaf for 3 pence, a penny less than traditional bakers, who struggled to compete. This economic pressure forced small bakehouses to cut costs, often through adulteration or lower wages, perpetuating the cycle of poverty for workers. For the baker in a traditional bakehouse, these changes were a distant reality. Most continued using brick ovens, kneading troughs and wooden peels, their methods unchanged since the early 19th century. The lack of capital meant they couldn't adopt new technology, locking them into labor-intensive routines. Apprentices still hauled heavy flour sacks, journeymen kneaded dough by hand, and masters stoked ovens, their bodies worn by the same tasks their predecessors performed. The contrast between factories and small bakehouses highlighted the era's inequalities, with wealthier businesses reaping the benefits of progress, while small bakers toiled in obscurity. Workers in bread factories faced new challenges. While steam ovens reduced the physical strain of stoking fires, the factory environment was noisy and fast-paced, with machines humming and workers rushing to keep up. The repetitive tasks, loading mixers, monitoring ovens, or packaging loaves, were less strenuous but more monotonous, as workers performed the same motion for hours. Factory wages were often lower than in small bakehouses, sometimes 10 shillings a week, as employers exploited the surplus of unskilled labor. Conditions remained harsh, with flour dust and heat still prevalent, though better ventilation in larger spaces reduced some respiratory risks. The social impact of these changes was significant. In traditional bakehouses, the baker's skill was a source of pride, passed down through apprenticeships. Factories devalued this expertise, turning baking into assembly line work where speed trumped craftsmanship. Journeymen, trained in traditional methods, found their skills obsolete, facing unemployment or lower-paying factory jobs. Apprentices, once hopeful of becoming masters, saw their prospects dim, as opening a bakehouse required capital few could save. Unions, like the Amalgamated Union of Operative Bakers, protested these changes, demanding better wages and conditions in factories. But their influence was limited, and strikes rarely disrupted the growing industrial system. Health and safety improved slightly in factories, as steam ovens reduced coal smoke and mechanical mixers lessened physical strain. However, accidents were common. Workers could catch hands in mixer blades or burn themselves on steam pipes, injuries that required costly medical care few could afford. The repetitive nature of factory work also caused new ailments, like muscle strain from operating cranks or standing for long shifts. Small bakehouses, meanwhile, remained dangerous, with burns, respiratory issues, and exhaustion unchanged by technological progress. The transition to industrial baking was slow, and by the end of the Victorian era, many small bakehouses persisted, their methods frozen in time. The baker's daily routine, mixing dough, firing the oven, shaping loaves, remained a grind, whether in a basement or a factory. For most, the promise of technology was out of reach, their lives defined by the same repetitive tasks that fed a nation. This unchanging rhythm, a blend of tradition and necessity, kept the baking trade tethered to its past, even as the world around it modernized. As we move to the next part, we'll explore the cultural significance of bread in Victorian society, its role in rituals, and its place in the daily lives of different classes. But for now, let the steady cadence of these technological details guide you deeper into rest. Bread was more than a staple. Food in Victorian Britain, it was a cornerstone of daily life, woven into the fabric of social, religious, and cultural practices across all classes, from the quartern loaf that sustained the working poor to the delicate rolls served at affluent tea tables. Bread carried deep symbolic meaning, reflecting status, survival, and tradition. For bakers, producing this vital commodity was a repetitive task, but its significance in society elevated their labor, even if their struggles went unnoticed. This part explores the monotonous details of bread's role in Victorian culture, its place in rituals, and its impact on daily life, narrated in a calm, soothing tone to guide you gently toward sleep. For the working class, bread was the foundation of existence, often making up half or more of their diet. A quartern loaf, weighing 4 pounds, was a daily purchase for laborers' families, costing 4 to 6 pence and shared among 5 or 6 people, eaten with dripping, cheese, or thin soup. It provided the calories needed for long factory shifts or manual work. The baker's role in producing these loaves was critical, as a single bad batch, dense, sour, or underbaked, could leave a family hungry. The repetitive process of mixing dough, kneading, and baking was a quiet act of service, repeated nightly in bakehouses across cities like London and Manchester. Bread's affordability made it a symbol of survival. its presence on the table a small victory against poverty. In poorer neighborhoods, bread was often bought daily, as families lacked storage or funds to stock up. The baker's shop, run by his wife or a female relative, was a hub of community life, where housewives queued each morning, exchanging gossip or complaints about rising prices. The baker, delivering loaves door to door or to street vendors, became a familiar figure, his baskets heavy with warm quartern loaves. Bartering was common. A loaf might be traded for vegetables or coal, reinforcing bread's role as a currency of necessity. This daily exchange, repeated in every working-class district, bound communities together, with bread at the center of their shared struggle. For the middle and upper classes, bread signified status. Fine white bread, made from expensive, sifted flour, was a luxury, its pale crust and soft texture a contrast to the coarse, grayish loaves of the poor. Cottage loaves, with their distinctive two-tiered shape, were a favorite for middle-class breakfasts, requiring the baker to shape and bake them with care to avoid separation. Rolls, small and tender, were served at tea parties or dinners, their delicate form a mark of refinement. These breads demanded extra labor, finer flour, precise shaping, cooler ovens, adding to the baker's repetitive tasks. Wealthier households expected consistency, rejecting any loaf with flaws, which put pressure on bakers to perfect every batch despite their exhaustion. Bread played a central role in religious rituals, deepening its cultural weight. In churches, the communion wafer, a simple bread made from flour and water, symbolized Christ's body, requiring bakers to produce it with precision for Sunday services. The process was meticulous, mixing a thin dough, rolling it into sheets and baking it briefly to keep it crisp, all done with reverence despite the late-night hours. Hot cross buns, baked for Good Friday, were another religious tradition, their spiced dough and scored crosses demanding extra care. Bakers mixed currants and cinnamon into the dough, shaped buns by hand, and slashed each with a knife, repeating the process dozens of times for festival demand. These buns, sold for a penny or two, were believed to hold spiritual power, with some households hanging them to ward off evil, adding to their significance. Secular traditions also centered on bread. At Christmas, bakers produced special loaves, like the Yule loaf, sometimes enriched with dried fruit or spices, requiring additional ingredients and time. These loaves, baked slowly to preserve flavor, were a treat for families, symbolizing festivity. Weddings and funerals often featured bread, with bakers donating loaves for communal feasts or charity. In rural areas, harvest festivals celebrated with plaited loaves, shaped into intricate braids by skilled bakers, showcased their craft, but demanded hours of extra work. These traditions, repeated annually, tied bread to the rhythm of Victorian life, with bakers at the heart of each ritual. Bread also carried superstition and folklore. A loaf baked on Christmas Eve was said to never mold, a belief that led customers to request special batches, adding to the baker's workload. Turning a loaf upside down was considered bad luck, and bakers were careful to place loaves right side up on shop shelves, a small but repetitive task. In some regions, bread was used in folk remedies. A crust soaked in milk was applied to wounds, believed to draw out infection. These beliefs, passed down through generations, reinforced bread's cultural importance, making the baker's labor a quiet contribution to tradition. The working class's dependence on bread made it a political issue. Bread riots, though less common than in the 18th century, erupted when prices spiked due to poor harvests or trade disruptions. Bakers faced the brunt of this anger, as customers blamed them for costs driven by millers or suppliers. The bread axe, enforced sporadically, regulated loaf weights to prevent shortchanging, requiring bakers to weigh each loaf carefully, a tedious task under scrutiny. Adulteration scandals, exposed by newspapers in the 1850s, eroded trust in bakers, who were accused of adding chalk or alum to stretch flour. These accusations, while often true, ignored the economic pressures that forced bakers to cut corners, trapping them in a cycle of suspicion. For the baker, these cultural roles added layers of responsibility. Producing communion wafers or festival buns required precision, as errors could offend customers or clergy. Meeting the daily demand for quartern loaves meant sleepless nights, while catering to wealthier clients demanded finer breads that strained resources. The baker's shop, run by women, was a social hub, but its success depended on consistent quality, with no room for mistakes. This relentless pressure, woven into the repetitive tasks of mixing, kneading, and baking, defined the baker's role as both provider and craftsman. Even as society overlooked his struggles, bread's cultural significance extended to literature and art. Novels like Charles Dickens's works often mentioned bread as a symbol of hardship or comfort, reflecting its universal presence. Paintings of the era depicted rustic loaves or elegant rolls, romanticizing the baker's labor while ignoring its toll. These images, seen by the middle class, reinforced bread's place in the Victorian imagination, but the baker himself remained invisible, his work reduced to the loaves on every table. This unchanging role of bread, from sustenance to symbol, shaped the baker's world, tying his labor to the heart of Victorian society. As we move to the next part, we'll explore the daily routines of customers who relied on the baker's bread, from workers to aristocrats, and how their habits influenced the trade. But for now, let the steady rhythm of these cultural details guide you deeper into sleep. In Victorian Britain, bread was the lifeblood of every household, shaping the daily routines of people across all classes. From laborers to aristocrats, the baker's relentless labor in the bakehouse fed a nation, with each loaf carrying the weight of survival, status, or ritual. Customers' habits, when and how they bought, ate, and valued bread, directly influenced the baker's work, creating a cycle of demand that drove the trade's grueling pace. This part explores the monotonous details of how Victorians incorporated bread into their daily lives, their purchasing patterns, and the impact on bakers, narrated in a calm, soothing tone to guide you gently toward sleep. For the working class, bread was the cornerstone of every meal, consumed from morning to night. A laborer's family, often 6 or more people, relied on a quartern loaf weighing 4 pounds to stretch across the day. The morning began early, around 5 or 6, when the housewife or an older child visited the baker's shop, just as the first loaves emerged from the bakehouse below. The shop, run by the baker's wife, was a small, crowded space, its counter piled with warm loaves. The housewife handed over 4 to 6 pence, carefully counting coins from a worn purse, and received a heavy, grayish loaf made from coarse flour. Back home, she sliced it with a blunt knife, dividing it into thick portions for the family's breakfast, often eaten with dripping or a scrape of margarine, washed down with weak tea. This routine repeated daily, as storage was scarce in cramped tenements, and bread staled quickly without preservatives. The housewife returned to the shop later, sometimes twice, for another loaf or cheaper day-old bread, bartering if money was tight. Her visits followed a predictable pattern: queuing with neighbors, exchanging brief words about prices or weather, and carrying the loaf home wrapped in a cloth. For laborers, bread was lunch, carried to factories or construction sites in a cloth bag, eaten dry or with a bit of cheese during a short break. Supper was similar, with bread soaked in broth or paired with boiled vegetables. The family gathered around a bare table in a dimly lit room. This reliance on bread meant bakers faced constant pressure to produce enough loaves. Their nights spent kneading and baking to meet the morning rush. Children played a key role in the bread-buying routine. In poorer households, young boys or girls, some as young as 7, were sent to the baker's shop before school or work. They clutched a few pennies, dodging carts and crowds to reach the counter, where they repeated their mother's order. 1 quartern loaf, occasionally a penny roll for a treat. The baker's wife weighed the loaf, ensuring it met the standard, as short weight could spark complaints. These children, often barefoot and shivering in winter, carried the heavy loaf home, a task repeated daily that taught them frugality and responsibility. Some worked as delivery boys for the baker, hauling baskets through streets, shouting to attract customers, their voices blending with the city's morning clamor. The middle class had a different relationship with bread, marked by choice and refinement. Their day began with breakfast, served around 8 in a dining room with polished furniture. The table held a cottage loaf or rolls, made from finer white flour, costing 6 to 8 pence. The housewife or a servant bought these from the baker's shop or had them delivered by a boy, who knocked politely and left a basket of fresh bread. The family spread butter or jam on thin slices, paired with tea or coffee, the bread's soft texture a sign of their status. Lunch might include rolls, served with cold meat or soup, while dinner featured bread as a side, its presence less central but still essential. These households bought less frequently, perhaps every other day, as they had pantries to store loaves, but they demanded consistency, rejecting any with a burnt crust or dense crumb. Wealthier households, including the upper class, treated bread as a minor but symbolic part of their meals. Their breakfasts, served in grand dining rooms, included delicate rolls or brioche-like breads, baked with milk and sugar for a tender texture. These were ordered in small batches, costing a shilling or more, and delivered directly to the kitchen by the baker's boy. Servants sliced and served them, often with preserves or cream, while the family discussed business or social engagements. Luncheons and dinners featured bread sparingly, overshadowed by meat and vegetables, but its quality was scrutinized, with bakers competing to supply the finest households. These customers rarely visited the shop themselves, relying on servants to handle purchases, their routines detached from the baker's labor but dependent on his skill. Bread's role extended to specific rituals. For the working class, Sunday meals were a small luxury, with a fresh loaf shared after church, perhaps paired with a rare bit of bacon. Festivals like Christmas or Easter brought hot cross buns or spiced loaves, ordered days in advance, adding to the baker's workload. Middle-class tea parties, held in the afternoon, featured thinly sliced bread with butter, arranged on fine china, a ritual that demanded perfect rolls from the baker. In religious households, bread was blessed before meals, a nod to its sacred role, while charity events saw bakers donate loaves to the poor, reinforcing their community ties. Purchasing patterns varied by region. In rural areas, villagers bought bread weekly from a local baker, often sharing a communal oven, their routines slower but no less dependent on the baker's output. Urban customers, pressed for time, bought daily, their urgency driving the baker's relentless schedule. Street vendors, often children or women, sold the baker's bread in markets or door to door, their cries of "fresh bread" echoing through streets, a sound as familiar as church bells. These vendors, paid a penny per dozen loaves sold, were an extension of the baker's reach, their repetitive routes ensuring bread reached every corner of the city. The baker's work was shaped by these routines. The morning rush meant producing hundreds of loaves by dawn, with journeymen and apprentices working through the night to meet demand. Middle-class orders for rolls or specialty breads required extra care, adding tasks to the baker's load. Complaints about price or quality were common, as customers felt the pinch of rising flour costs, blaming the baker rather than market forces. Adulteration scandals, widely reported, made customers suspicious, forcing bakers to weigh loaves publicly to prove honesty. A tedious task under watchful eyes. These daily routines, from the laborer's frugal breakfast to the aristocrat's delicate tea, tied Victorian society to the baker's labor. Each loaf, carried home or served on a silver tray, was the result of hours of kneading, baking, and delivery, a cycle that never paused. As we move to the next part, we'll explore the legal and regulatory challenges bakers faced, from weights and measures laws to adulteration crackdowns. But for now, let the steady rhythm of these consumer details guide you deeper into Sleep, the Victorian. Baking trade operated under a web of legal and regulatory pressures that added layers of complexity to the baker's already grueling routine. From laws governing bread weights to efforts to curb adulteration, bakers faced constant scrutiny, their work subject to rules that aimed to protect consumers but often deepened their struggles. These regulations, enforced unevenly, shaped the daily tasks of mixing, baking, and selling, while fines and inspections loomed as threats to their livelihood. This part explores the monotonous details of the legal challenges bakers faced, the regulations they navigated, and their impact on the trade, narrated in a calm, soothing tone to guide you gently toward sleep. The Bread Acts, dating back to the 18th century and updated in 1836, were the primary laws governing the trade. These required bakers to sell bread by weight, ensuring customers received the standard quartern loaf, which should weigh 4 pounds after baking. In the shop, run by the baker's wife or a relative, every loaf was weighed on a balance scale before sale, a repetitive task that slowed transactions. Customers, aware of the law, often demanded to see the scale, watching closely as the baker or shopkeeper adjusted iron, weights to confirm the loaf's size. A loaf found to be underweight could lead to a fine of up to 5 shillings, a significant loss when weekly profits were often less than a pound. To avoid penalties, bakers weighed dough carefully before baking, accounting for water loss in the oven, a precise but tedious process repeated dozens of times per batch. Inspectors, known as weights and measures officers, visited bakehouses unannounced, carrying their own scales to check loaves. These visits, though sporadic, were a source of anxiety. The inspector would select a loaf from the shop's counter, place it on his scale, and compare it to the legal standard. If found wanting, the baker faced not only a fine but also public shaming, as newspapers sometimes published offenders' names. To prepare, bakers kept extra dough on hand, shaping slightly larger loaves to account for variations in baking, which increased costs and waste. This constant vigilance, checking and rechecking weights, added to the night's workload, with journeymen and apprentices, trained to measure dough with precision to avoid errors. Adulteration was another major regulatory issue. By the 1850s, public outcry over bakers adding alum, chalk, or potato flour to stretch. Supplies led to the Food Adulteration Act of 1860. This law aimed to ensure bread was pure, but enforcement was weak, relying on local authorities who rarely had the resources to test samples. Inspectors might visit a bakehouse, take a loaf, and send it for analysis, a process that could take weeks. If adulterants were found, fines ranged from a few shillings to £1, a heavy blow for small bakers. To avoid detection, bakers mixed additives carefully, often at night when no one watched, measuring small amounts of alum into the dough to whiten it, or chalk to bulk it up. This secretive task, repeated batch after batch, added stress, as discovery could ruin their reputation or business. The process of complying with these laws was monotonous but critical. In the bakehouse, the master or journeyman checked flour sacks for quality, as poor flour could lead to accusations of adulteration. They sifted it slowly, ensuring no lumps or foreign matter remained, a task that filled the air with dust and irritated lungs. When mixing dough, they measured ingredients with care, using notched sticks or scales to ensure consistency, knowing that any deviation could attract scrutiny. The shopkeeper, often the baker's wife, kept meticulous records of sales and ingredients, jotting figures in a ledger by lamplight to prove compliance if questioned. These records, reviewed during inspections, had to be flawless, adding to the daily grind. Sanitation regulations, though less formal, were another challenge. By the 1870s, public health acts required bakehouses to be clean, with walls free of mold and floors swept of debris. Inspectors checked for rodents or insects, common in damp basements, and could order costly repairs or fines for violations. Bakers and apprentices spent hours cleaning, scraping troughs, sweeping floors, and setting traps, only for pests to return in the warm, flour-rich environment. Water, drawn from public pumps, had to be checked for clarity, as contaminated water could lead to health complaints and fines. These tasks, repeated nightly, were a constant burden, as the bakehouse's conditions made compliance difficult. Licensing added another layer of regulation. In some cities, bakers needed a license to sell bread, costing a few shillings annually. The process involved paperwork, a rare skill for bakers with limited education, and meant visits to local offices, taking time away from the bakehouse. Failure to renew a license could halt operations, a risk that loomed over small businesses already stretched thin. Delivery boys, carrying baskets through streets, also faced rules, as some areas required permits for street vending, with fines for non-compliance. These regulations, while minor, piled up, each requiring attention in an already exhausting routine. The legal system favored customers over bakers. Complaints about short weight or poor quality were common, especially among the working class, who felt cheated by rising prices. A customer might report a baker to the authorities, triggering an inspection that disrupted the shop's rhythm. Court appearances, if fines were contested, meant lost work hours and legal fees, which few bakers could afford. Newspapers fueled public distrust. Printing exposés on adulteration or naming bakers caught breaking rules, making compliance a matter of survival. The baker's wife, running the shop, bore much of this pressure, soothing angry customers while ensuring every loaf met standards. Unions, like the Amalgamated Union of Operative Bakers, pushed back against some regulations, arguing that weight laws ignored the realities of baking, where oven heat could vary. They also demanded better enforcement of sanitation rules to protect workers, not just consumers. However, their influence was limited, and bakers remained caught between regulators and customers. their work scrutinized from all sides. The threat of fines or closure forced them to prioritize compliance, even at the cost of sleep or profit. These regulatory challenges, woven into the daily tasks of weighing, mixing, and cleaning, added a layer of monotony to the baker's life. Each loaf, each sale, each inspection was a reminder of the rules governing their trade, a cycle as unrelenting as the oven's heat. As we move to the next part, we'll explore the role of children in the baking trade, from apprentices to delivery boys, and their contributions to the bakehouse. But for now, let the steady rhythm of these legal details guide you deeper into sleep. In the Victorian baking trade, children were a vital, if often overlooked, part of the workforce, their small hands and tireless energy supporting the relentless cycle of bread production. From apprentices learning the craft to delivery boys hawking loaves in the streets, children as young as 7 or 8 toiled alongside adults in bakehouses and shops, their lives shaped by the same grueling demands that defined the trade. Their roles, though repetitive and exhausting, were essential to the baker's ability to meet the constant demand for bread. This part explores the monotonous details of children's contributions to the baking trade, their daily tasks, and the hardships they endured, narrated in a calm, soothing tone to guide you gently toward sleep. The most common role for children was as apprentices, typically boys aged 12 to 16, bound to a master baker for several years to learn the trade. These boys, often from poor families or orphanages, were sent to the bakehouse to ease financial burdens at home while gaining a skill. Their workday began late at night, around 10 or 11 when they arrived in the cramped, flour-dusted basement. Their first task was fetching water, carrying heavy buckets from public pumps or wells, often a quarter-mile away. Each bucket, holding 2 gallons and weighing nearly 20 pounds, strained their young arms, and spills were common on uneven streets, forcing them to return for more. This task, repeated several times a night, was critical, as water was needed for dough and cleaning. In the bakehouse, apprentices handled menial chores that kept the operation running. They hauled flour sacks, weighing up to 280 pounds, from storage to the kneading trough, a task that required dragging or rolling the sacks across the floor, bruising their hands and shoulders. They stoked the oven, shoveling coal or wood into the firebox, a job that exposed them to heat and smoke, stinging their eyes and throats. The fire needed constant tending to maintain a steady 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and the apprentice learned to gauge the heat by sight, a skill developed through endless repetition. Cleaning was another daily duty. They scraped dried dough from the trough with a metal blade, swept flour from the floor, and emptied rodent traps, grim tasks that filled the air with dust and tested their endurance. As they gained experience, apprentices were trusted with small baking tasks. They might stir dough in the trough, their arms aching as they mixed flour and water, or shape rolls under a journeyman's watchful eye. Shaping required rolling dough into small balls, a precise but repetitive motion repeated dozens of times per batch. Mistakes, like uneven rolls or lumpy dough, earned sharp words or a cuff from the master, as a bad batch could waste costly ingredients. Baking itself was rarely allowed, as the oven's heat demanded skill, but older apprentices might use the peel to slide loaves in or out, risking burns if their hands slipped. These tasks, learned through years of practice, were the foundation of their training, each motion a step toward becoming a journeyman. Delivery boys, often younger children aged 7 to 12, were another key part of the trade. These boys, sometimes the baker's own children or hired from poor families, carried baskets of bread through city streets, selling to customers or delivering to shops. Their day began at dawn, when the baker's first loaves were ready. They loaded wicker baskets, each holding a dozen quartern loaves or 50 rolls, weighing up to 40 pounds, and set out into the morning fog. Their routes, covering several miles, followed a predictable pattern. Knocking on doors, shouting, "Fresh bread," in markets, or handing loaves to shopkeepers. Each sale, a penny or 2 per loaf, was recorded mentally or scratched on a slate. As most boys had little schooling, the routine was exhausting. Their small frames weighed down by baskets, their feet sore from cobbled streets. The physical toll on these children was severe. Apprentices, working 17-hour shifts, suffered from exhaustion, their growing bodies deprived of sleep. They snatched naps on flour sacks during dough-proving times, rarely getting more than 4 hours of rest. Flour dust, inhaled nightly, caused coughing and wheezing, the early signs of baker's asthma, while the bakehouse's heat led to rashes and dehydration. Burns from the oven or hot water were common, leaving scars on their hands, and lifting heavy loads caused back pain or hernias, injuries that could disable them by adulthood. Delivery boys faced their own risks: falls on slippery streets, collisions with carts, or frostbite in winter, as many went barefoot or wore thin shoes. Their diet, mostly bread from the bakehouse with occasional dripping or soup, was inadequate for growing children, leading to malnutrition and stunted growth. Diseases like tuberculosis thrived in the damp, crowded bakehouses and tenements where they lived, and medical care was a luxury beyond their reach. Home remedies, like vinegar for burns or tea for colds, were all they had, applied by the baker's wife or older siblings. Education was minimal. Apprentices and delivery boys, bound to work, rarely attended school, leaving many illiterate or with only basic reading skills learned from church or charity schools. Socially, these children were isolated. Apprentices, often far from family, lived in the bakehouse or shared attics with other workers, their world confined to the basement's walls. Delivery boys interacted with customers but had little time for play, their routes consuming their energy. Friendships formed with other apprentices or street vendors, but these were fleeting, broken by the demands of work or the hierarchy of the bakehouse. Punishment was common. A spilled bucket or dropped loaf could mean a beating, and the master's authority was absolute, leaving children with no recourse. Legally, children in the baking trade were barely protected. The Factory Acts, which limited hours for some industries, did not apply to bakehouses, classified as domestic work. By the 1860s, some regulations restricted night work for those under 16, but enforcement was lax, and bakers ignored them to meet demand. Parents, desperate for income, sent children to work, and masters exploited their cheap labor, paying apprentices as little as 2 shillings a week. Reformers, alarmed by reports of child labor, pushed for change, but progress was slow, and children remained a vital part of the trade. Despite their hardships, these children were essential to the baker's operation. Apprentices kept the bakehouse running, their chores freeing journeymen for skilled tasks, while delivery boys ensured bread reached customers, boosting sales. Their labor, though repetitive and grueling, was a quiet contribution to a trade that fed millions, their efforts unseen behind the loaves on every table. As we move to the final part, we'll explore the legacy of the Victorian baking trade and its lasting impact on modern baking. But for now, let the steady rhythm of these details guide you deeper into Sleep, the Victorian baking trade, with its grueling labor and relentless demands, left an enduring mark on the history of food production, shaping not only the daily lives of bakers but also the evolution of baking into the modern era. While the small basement bakehouses of the 19th century gradually gave way to industrialized methods, the traditions, struggles, and innovations of Victorian bakers laid the foundation for how bread is produced and consumed today. This final part explores the monotonous details of the baking trade's legacy, its influence on modern practices, and the echoes of its challenges, narrated in a calm, soothing tone to guide you gently toward sleep. The Victorian bakehouse, with its brick oven and wooden kneading trough, was a symbol of a craft rooted in tradition. Bakers, apprentices, and journeymen toiled through the night, mixing dough, stoking fires, and shaping loaves by hand, producing the quartern loaves and rolls that fed millions. This labor-intensive process, repeated daily, ensured bread remained the cornerstone of the Victorian diet. From the working-class table to the aristocratic dining room, the skills developed, kneading to the perfect texture, judging oven heat, scaling dough precisely, were passed down through apprenticeships, preserving techniques that valued consistency and quality. These methods, though arduous, became the bedrock of artisanal baking, influencing modern bakers who revive traditional recipes for sourdough or cottage loaves. The introduction of steam-powered ovens and mechanical mixers in the late Victorian era marked a turning point. By the 1870s, large bread factories in cities like London began using steam ovens, capable of baking hundreds of loaves at once, reducing the physical strain of stoking fires. Mechanical mixers, with their rotating blades, cut kneading time from 30 minutes to 10, easing the baker's workload but devaluing manual skills. These innovations, though unaffordable for small bakehouses, set the stage for industrial baking, enabling mass production that fed growing urban populations. Today's automated bakeries, with their conveyor belts and computer-controlled ovens, trace their origins to these early machines, which prioritized efficiency over craftsmanship. Adulteration, a widespread practice in Victorian bakehouses, also left a legacy. The use of alum, chalk, or potato flour to stretch supplies led to public outcry and the Food Adulteration Act of 1860, one of the first laws to regulate food safety. Though enforcement was weak, it sparked a movement toward stricter standards, influencing modern food regulations that ensure bread is free of harmful additives. The scandals of the era, reported in newspapers, raised consumer awareness, a precursor to today's demand for transparency in food production. Modern labels listing ingredients and nutritional information owe a debt to the Victorian push for pure bread, driven by the same customers who bought from overworked bakers. The social structure of the bakehouse, masters, journeymen, apprentices, and women in the shop, shaped labor practices that lingered into the 20th century. The apprenticeship system, training boys through repetitive tasks, preserved baking as a skilled trade, even as factories de-skilled the workforce. Unions, like the Amalgamated Union of Operative Bakers, fought for better wages and hours, laying the groundwork for modern labor rights in food industries. The role of women, managing shops and accounts, highlighted their importance in small businesses, a model that persists in family-run bakeries today. Children, toiling as apprentices or delivery boys, were part of a broader reliance on child labor, which reforms gradually curtailed, leading to modern protections for young workers. Health and safety challenges in the Victorian bakehouse also had lasting impacts. The respiratory issues from flour dust, burns from ovens, and exhaustion from long hours prompted early public health campaigns. By the late 19th century, sanitation laws required cleaner bakehouses, reducing risks like tuberculosis, while later regulations limited night work for children. These efforts influenced modern workplace safety standards, ensuring better ventilation, protective gear, and limits on working hours. The baker's asthma that plagued Victorian workers led to studies on occupational health, contributing to today's awareness of workplace hazards in food production. Culturally, bread's significance in Victorian society, its role in survival, rituals, and status, continues to resonate. The quartern loaf, a staple for the poor, inspired the hearty, affordable breads of today, while the cottage loaf and hot cross buns remain, nostalgic symbols in artisanal bakeries. Religious traditions, like communion wafers and festival buns, persist in modern ceremonies, tying contemporary baking to its Victorian roots. The folklore surrounding bread, such as superstitions about upside-down loaves, has faded but lingers in rural communities, a reminder of the era's beliefs. Economically, the Victorian baking trade's struggles foreshadowed the challenges of small businesses in a mechanized world. Small bakehouses, unable to afford steam ovens, were outcompeted by factories, a pattern repeated in modern retail where independent bakeries compete with supermarket chains. The pressure to keep prices low, driven by customer demand, mirrors today's market, where mass-produced bread dominates, but artisanal bakeries carve a niche with high-quality, handcrafted loaves. The baker's fight for survival, balancing costs and profits, remains a reality for small-scale producers. The physical bakehouse, with its cramped, dusty conditions, is largely gone, replaced by modern facilities with stainless steel surfaces and automated equipment. Yet, the memory of the Victorian bakehouse lives on in historical accounts and museums, where restored ovens and tools showcase the era's labor. Documentaries and books, like those by food historians, celebrate the baker's craft, drawing on Victorian records to highlight their role in feeding a nation. Artisanal baking movements, emphasizing traditional methods, pay homage to the skills of Victorian bakers, even as they use modern tools to ease the physical toll. The legacy of the Victorian baker is one of quiet endurance, their nightly toil producing the bread that sustained a society. Their struggles, health risks, economic pressures, and regulatory burdens shaped the industry's evolution. From basement bakehouses to global food production, the repetitive tasks of mixing, kneading, and baking, performed in the glow of a brick oven, left a mark on history, a testament to the workers whose labor went unnoticed. As this series ends, let the steady rhythm of these legacy details guide you deeper into sleep, closing the story of the Victorian baking trade with a sense of calm completion.